she died in silence, in a locked room full of secrets no one was ever supposed to find. But when they finally opened her drawers, they uncovered a truth so shocking, it erased everything people thought they knew about her. The room was too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that brings peace, but the kind that lingers, heavy and watchful, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Behind drawn curtains in a modest New York apartment, a woman lay motionless on her bed. The early morning light pressed faintly against the fabric, unable to enter, as though even the sun had been kept out of whatever truth lived inside that room. She was dying. Each breath came slower than the last, shallow and fragile, slipping further away with every passing second. There was no family gathered at her side, no final words spoken, no hands to hold, only silence. And the drawers, locked, every single one of them, lined against the walls, tucked beneath tables, hidden inside cabinets, dozens of drawers, each carefully sealed, each guarding something she had spent a lifetime protecting. No labels, no clues, just quiet defiance. To anyone else, it would have seemed like caution, but this was something else. This was fear. Outside, New York moved on without hesitation. Carriages rattled along the streets, voices rose and fell in the distance. Life continued, indifferent to the quiet ending unfolding behind those closed curtains. Inside, time was running out. Her eyes, once sharp and observant, now barely opened. But somewhere beneath the fading strength, something remained in awareness, a tension, as if even in her final moments, she knew what would happen next. Because the truth was never meant to be found. Not like this. Not after everything she had done to bury it. Her fingers twitched slightly against the fabric of the bed, a faint, almost imperceptible movement. Then, stillness again. The last breath came quietly, so quietly, in fact, that for a moment nothing seemed to change. But something had, because the moment she was gone, the secrets she had hidden so carefully were no longer hers to protect. And soon, someone would start opening those drawers, one by one. And when they did, they wouldn't just uncover a life. They would uncover a lie so profound, it would rewrite her entire existence. Long before the locked drawers, before the silence, before the life she built so carefully began to unravel, there was a beginning. Washington, D.C. The year was 1879. The city was still healing. Just over a decade had passed since the Civil War, but its shadow lingered in every street, every conversation, every opportunity granted or denied. Brick homes lined the roads beneath tall elm trees, and the air carried a strange mixture of hope and hesitation, as if the nation itself had not yet decided what it wanted to become. For African Americans, freedom had been declared, but not fully delivered. And yet, in one household tucked within this uncertain world, something remarkable was taking shape. It was here that Belle Marion Greener was born. Her arrival was quiet, unremarkable to the outside world, but within her family, it carried weight. Because Belle was not born into struggle alone. She was born into expectation. The Greener household was not like most. It was a place where books filled every corner, where ideas were discussed as seriously as survival, and where education was not a privilege but a responsibility. Conversations drifted through the halls about politics, law, literature, and the future of a people still fighting to be seen as equal. Even as an infant, Belle entered a world already in motion, a world shaped by ambition, by discipline, by the belief that excellence could defy limitation. Her father was not an ordinary man navigating an ordinary life, and her mother was not simply raising children within the boundaries society had set for her. Together, they were building something fragile yet powerful, a life that stood at the edge of possibility. But possibility, in a world like theirs, always came with a cost. And though Belle could not yet understand it, the foundation being laid around her, this world of intellect, pride, and quiet defiance, would one day become the very thing she would have to leave behind. Not because she wanted to, but because she would have to survive. The house that built her. In that house, Greatness was not something spoken about, it was expected. Belle Marion Greener grew up surrounded by a force she could not yet name, but felt in everything. In the silence of her father's study, in the rhythm of her mother's piano, in the weight of every book placed carefully into her small hands. Her father, Richard Theodore Greener, was a man who carried history with him. He had walked into Harvard at a time when men like him were never meant to, and he walked out as its first black graduate, a living contradiction to everything the world insisted was impossible. At home, he was calm, measured, but unyielding. Discipline was not harsh, it was constant. He believed brilliance had to be trained, sharpened, protected, and he saw that potential in his children, especially in Belle. She noticed the way his voice changed when he spoke about justice, the quiet intensity behind his words, the belief that knowledge could repair a broken world. His study was sacred ground, lined with books, papers stacked with precision, every object in its place. Belle would stand at the doorway sometimes, watching, learning without being taught. Her mother, Genevieve, brought something entirely different, yet just as powerful. Where Richard was structure, she was warmth. Where he demanded excellence, she nurtured it. Evenings in the house often softened under the sound of piano keys, her music drifting gently through the rooms, wrapping the family in something that felt safe, almost untouched by the outside world. She taught her children patience, grace, and the quiet art of understanding people, not just facts. Together, they created a balance that felt complete. But it was not just the parents who shaped Belle. The house itself was alive with ideas. Visitors came often, men whose names carried weight, voices filled with urgency and vision. Conversations about civil rights, progress, and the future of Black America echoed through the walls. Belle listened from corners, from staircases, from behind half-closed doors. She did not always understand the words, but she understood their importance. She understood that the world outside was not as safe, not as fair, as the one inside this home. And slowly, without anyone telling her, she began to learn something deeper, that who you were in this world could shape everything that followed, that knowledge could open doors but not always keep them open, and that even in a house built on strength, brilliance, and love, there were forces beyond its walls, already pressing in, already waiting to test how strong that foundation really was. A childhood surrounded by mines. As Belle grew older, the world inside her home expanded far beyond its walls, shaped not by distance, but by the minds that passed through it. The Greener household became a quiet center of gravity for thinkers, educators, and activists, people who carried the future in their voices and the weight of history in their words. Evenings were rarely silent. The air would fill with discussion, sometimes calm and reflective, other times charged with urgency, as if every idea spoken might change something beyond that room. Belle would sit nearby, unnoticed, her small frame still but her mind alive, absorbing everything. She learned the rhythm of intellectual debate before she fully understood its meaning, recognizing when a voice carried conviction, when silence meant disagreement, when a pause held more truth than speech. Names like Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois moved through conversations with reverence. Their influence felt even in absence. These were not distant figures to Belle, they were part of the atmosphere she breathed. In that environment, learning was not limited to lessons or books. It lived in the way people spoke, the way they challenged each other, the way they refused to accept the limits imposed on them by the world outside. Belle's education began long before any formal schooling could shape it. Her parents guided her through subjects far beyond what most children, especially Black girls at the time, were ever offered. Arithmetic, language, history, literature, music. Each was introduced not as obligation, but as necessity. Knowledge was survival, knowledge was power, and Belle embraced it with a quiet intensity that set her apart even within her own family. She developed a habit of reading late into the evening, curled beside a lamp, lost in pages meant for older minds. Sometimes her father would find her there, watching silently, as if measuring something deeper than intelligence, perhaps recognizing that same inner fire he carried within himself. But books gave Belle more than knowledge. They gave her awareness, Through stories and histories, she began to see patterns: who was remembered, who was forgotten, who was given power, and who had to fight for it. She started to understand that the world was not built equally, that some lives moved freely while others were constantly watched, weighed, and judged before they even spoke. And without realizing it, she began to learn something even more complex: that identity itself could shape opportunity, could open doors, or quietly close them. It was a realization that did not frighten her at first, only settled into her thoughts like a question waiting for its answer. But that question would not remain simple for long, because outside the warmth of her home, the world was far less forgiving. And soon, the lessons she had absorbed in safety would be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. Learning to read the world beyond books. As the years passed, Belle's understanding of the world deepened in ways that no single lesson could teach her. Inside her home, knowledge had always felt structured, purposeful, almost protective, but outside, it was unpredictable, uneven, and often unfair. Washington itself became her second classroom. It was a city caught between two identities, still shaped by the scars of the Civil War, while cautiously stepping towards something new. Opportunities existed, but they were fragile, often dependent on how a person was seen before they were ever heard. Belle began to notice this in small, quiet moments. The way certain doors opened more easily for some than others. The way conversations shifted depending on who entered the room. The way her father's presence commanded respect in some spaces and resistance in others. These observations stayed with her, forming a kind of silent awareness that guided how she moved, how she listened, how she understood people. She realized that intelligence alone was not always enough, that the world judged quickly, often unfairly, and rarely corrected itself. At home, her father spoke openly about these realities. She would hear the frustration in his voice as he discussed political decisions, missed opportunities, and the slow, painful progress of justice. Yet beneath that frustration was something unbreakable, a belief that dignity could still be maintained, that excellence was a form of resistance. Her mother, however, moved through these same realities differently. Where her father confronted, she navigated. Where he insisted, she adapted. Belle began to see that survival in their world was not just about strength, it was also about subtlety, about knowing when to speak and when silence carried more power. This contrast between her parents did not confuse her, it taught her. She learned to observe before acting, to understand before responding. She studied people the way she studied books, searching for patterns, intentions, unspoken meanings. It became instinctive, almost necessary. Even among her siblings, expectations were clear. They were not simply children, they were reflections of what their family represented. Their behavior, their education, their discipline, all of it mattered. Belle felt that weight, but she did not resist it. Instead, she absorbed it, carrying it quietly, letting it shape her from within. And yet, beneath all of this learning, something else was forming. A subtle awareness that the life she was being prepared for, the life of intellect, integrity, and visible achievement, might not be enough to protect her. That there were forces in the world that could not be reasoned with, only navigated. It was not fear that settled into her, but caution. A careful, growing understanding that identity was not just something you were born with, it was something the world interpreted, often incorrectly, and sometimes dangerously. This realization did not change her yet, but it stayed with her, quiet, patient, waiting for the moment when it would no longer be a thought but a decision. The first signs of fracture. At first, the changes were so subtle they could almost be dismissed as imagination. Nothing in the Greener household broke suddenly. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, no single moment that could be pointed to and named as the beginning of the end. Instead, it began in silence, in pauses that lasted a little too long, in glances that carried meaning without words, in a shift so delicate that only someone as observant as Belle could truly feel it. She noticed it in the way her father lingered less in the evenings, retreating more often into his study, the door closing just a bit more firmly than before. The room that once felt like a place of inspiration now seemed guarded, almost distant, papers piled higher on his desk, his focus sharper, but his presence within the family softer, as though part of him had already begun to withdraw. Her mother, too, had changed, but differently. Genevieve moved through the house with the same grace, the same composure, but there was a tension beneath it now, something held tightly beneath the surface. Her voice remained gentle, yet there were moments when it carried a quiet strain, especially when she asked simple questions. "Are you well? Is everything all right?" As if the answers mattered more than they should. Family gatherings, once filled with lively debate and laughter, grew slightly quieter. The conversations still happened, the ideas still flowed, but something beneath them had shifted. The warmth was still there, but it no longer reached quite as deeply. Belle felt it most during the spaces between words. She began to sense that something unspoken was growing between her parents, something neither of them was ready to name, yet both were already living with. It unsettled her, not because she understood it, but because she could not. And for the first time, the home that had always felt certain felt fragile. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the hallway, Belle paused outside her parents' room. The door was not fully closed, and from inside came the sound of voices low, controlled, but unmistakably strained. She could not make out the words, only the tone. It was not anger. It was something quieter, something heavier. The kind of conversation where every word mattered too much to be spoken freely. A lamp inside flickered, its light trembling against the walls, spilling faintly into the hallway where Belle stood frozen. She watched that light for a long moment, the way it brightened, then dimmed, as if unsure whether it would hold or give in to darkness. And though she did not yet understand what was happening behind that door, she felt it deeply, instinctively, that something inside her world had begun to shift. Not break, not yet, but bend. And once something bends under pressure, it rarely returns to its original shape. The choice that changed everything. The moment that would alter the course of their lives did not arrive with noise or confrontation. It came quietly, almost invisibly, written in careful ink on a single sheet of paper, a census record. Nothing more than a routine document, one of countless forms filled out across the country. And yet, within that ordinary act, Genevieve made a decision that would ripple through every part of her family's future. When she reached the line that asked for race, she did not hesitate long. Perhaps she had already thought about it, weighed it, lived with the question in silence before ever holding the pen. And then, with deliberate control, she wrote a word that did not match the truth of their lineage: white. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a small detail, easily overlooked. But in that time, in that place, it was everything. It determined how the world would see them, how it would treat them, what doors might open, and which would remain forever closed. To Genevieve, it was not betrayal. It was protection. She was raising children in a society that measured worth through the narrowest of lenses, where opportunity could vanish before it even appeared, simply because of how a person was perceived. She had seen it, lived it, understood it in ways that could not be ignored. This was not about pride. It was about survival, but when Richard discovered what she had done, the meaning of that single word changed completely. To him, it was not protection, it was denial, a rejection of truth, of identity, of everything he had fought for. He had built his life on the belief that dignity came from standing firm, from refusing to bend under pressure, no matter the cost. And now, within his own home, that principle had been quietly undone. The conversation that followed was not explosive. There were no shattered objects, no raised voices echoing through the halls. Instead, it was controlled, restrained, each word chosen carefully, as if both of them understood that what was being said could not be taken back. They spoke across something that had already begun to divide them, a difference, not just of opinion, but of belief. Belle did not hear the full conversation, but she did not need to. She felt the change in the air immediately. It settled over the house like a weight, pressing into every room, every interaction. Her father's movements became heavier, more deliberate. Her mother's composure, though still intact, now carried an edge of exhaustion. And for the first time, Belle understood that the tension she had sensed was not temporary. It had a source, and that source could not be easily undone. That single word, written in quiet ink, had done more than change a record. It had drawn a line between two ways of surviving in the world, and from that moment forward, nothing in their home would ever feel entirely whole again. The silence that followed after the truth was discovered. The house did not erupt, it quieted. The kind of quiet that settles after something irreversible has already been said, when words no longer have the power to repair what has been broken. Richard did not shout. He did not accuse in anger, but something in him withdrew, not suddenly, but with a steady finality that was far more unsettling. The man who once filled the house with conviction now moved through it with a measured distance, as if every step required careful thought. His presence remained, but its warmth had changed. Conversations became shorter, more deliberate. Where there had once been shared purpose, there was now separation, subtle but undeniable. Genevieve, on the other hand, carried forward with quiet resolve. She did not undo what she had written, nor did she attempt to defend it openly. Instead, she adapted, moving through each day with a composure that concealed the weight she now bore alone. Her actions spoke in place of explanation. Meals were prepared, lessons continued, the household maintained its structure, but beneath it all was a tension that could not be disguised. Belle watched everything. She noticed the way her father no longer lingered in shared spaces, how his time became increasingly consumed by work beyond the home. She saw the careful distance her mother kept, not out of fear, but out of an understanding that something fragile had already been pushed too far. Even the simplest interactions felt altered, as though every word passed through an invisible filter before being spoken. The home still functioned, still held its shape, but it no longer felt the same. It was as if a line had been drawn down its center, unseen but deeply felt, dividing not just two people, but two ways of believing. For Belle, the shift was both confusing and undeniable. She did not fully grasp the principles at stake, but she understood the outcome. Something had been lost, something that could not be named, but could be felt in every quiet moment, every avoided glance, every unfinished sentence. And in that silence, she began to learn a new kind of awareness. That conflict did not always arrive with noise, that the most important changes often happened beneath the surface, where they could not be easily seen, but could be deeply lived. The house that had once felt like a place of certainty now held questions. And though no one spoke them aloud, they lingered in every room. Questions about truth, about survival, about what a person must hold on to and what they might be forced to let go. These questions did not demand answers immediately. They waited. Just as the distance between her parents continued to grow, slowly but steadily, shaping a future that none of them could yet fully see, but all of them had already begun to live, the departure that said everything. In the end, there was no dramatic farewell, no moment that marked the breaking point with certainty. By the time the decision was made, the distance had already settled too deeply to be reversed. Richard did not announce his leaving as an act of anger. If anything, it carried the quiet weight of resignation. An opportunity had presented itself: work abroad, far from Washington, far from the life that had begun to fracture in ways he could neither accept nor repair. Vladivostok, a place distant enough to feel like another world entirely. To others, it might have seemed like ambition, another step in a career already defined by achievement, but within the walls of his home, it meant something else. It meant leaving behind not just a city, but a family that no longer reflected the principles he had built his life upon. Preparations were made without urgency, but with a finality that could not be mistaken. Papers were arranged, personal belongings gathered. Conversations, when they happened, remained composed, restrained, as though both Richard and Genevieve understood that anything more would only deepen what could not be undone. Belle watched it unfold in fragments. A suitcase left open longer than usual, her father spending more time alone, the absence of discussion where there should have been explanation. She felt the shift before she understood it. Children often do. The day he left did not carry the weight it deserved, not at first. There were no tears in the open, no visible collapse of the life they had shared. Richard stood with the same composed presence he had always carried, offering parting words that were careful, measured, almost distant. He did not linger. He did not turn the moment into something larger than it was. And perhaps that was what made it so final. Belle stood there, watching him go, unable to fully grasp what was happening, yet sensing that something irreversible had just taken place. The space he left behind was immediate. It settled into the house like an echo that refused to fade. His study remained, his books untouched, his presence still visible in every ordered detail, but he was no longer there to give them meaning. Letters would come later, written from across the world, describing unfamiliar landscapes, distant routines, a life that felt increasingly separate from the one he had left behind. His words were precise, informative, but something essential was missing: warmth, connection. Over time, even those letters began to feel like they belonged to someone else. And when news arrived that he had built another life abroad, formed new ties, created a new family, the distance became complete. For Belle, the loss was not loud. It did not break her in an instant. Instead, it settled quietly, becoming part of her, shaping the way she understood absence, the way she processed change. She still admired him. That never disappeared, but the closeness they once shared faded into something more distant, more complicated, something she could not yet name. In the silence that followed his departure, one truth became clear, even if no one spoke it aloud. The family she had known, the one built on shared ideals, shared identity, shared purpose, was gone. And in its place, something new would have to be created, not out of choice, but out of necessity. Rewriting the family. In the quiet aftermath of Richard's departure, the house did not collapse. It transformed. Where his presence had once defined structure and principle, Genevieve now stepped forward with a different kind of strength, one shaped not by ideals alone, but by urgency. She understood something that could no longer be ignored. The world her children were growing into would not reward truth the way their father had believed. It would judge quickly, harshly, and often unfairly. And this time, she would not leave their future to chance. The changes began subtly, almost imperceptibly, woven into the fabric of daily life, so gently that they could have been mistaken for coincidence. But they were not. They were deliberate. The first shift came with their name. Greener, so closely tied to Richard, to his legacy, to a history that was both proud and vulnerable, began to disappear. In its place, a simpler version emerged. Green. Just one letter removed, yet the effect was profound. It softened questions before they were asked. It created distance from a past that others might scrutinize. It made them easier to accept. Belle noticed it the first time her mother introduced them that way in public. There was no explanation, no announcement, just a quiet correction, spoken with confidence, as if it had always been true, and no one questioned it. That was the moment Belle began to understand how easily the world could be guided by what it expected to hear. Her own name followed soon after. Marion, a part of her identity that had never felt essential, slipped quietly into the background. In its place came something new, D. Costa, a name chosen carefully, crafted with intention. It carried a European tone, one that explained her appearance in a way that would not invite suspicion. When she asked about it, her mother's answer was simple, almost gentle: Portuguese. It was enough. Enough to satisfy curiosity. Enough to close doors before they could open in the wrong direction. Even Genevieve reshaped herself, adopting a Dutch variation of her maiden name, adding another layer to the story she was constructing piece by piece. None of this was discussed openly as a transformation. There were no long conversations about identity, no emotional declarations. Instead, it unfolded through action, through repetition, through quiet consistency, and slowly, it became real. Belle adapted quickly, not because she was told to, but because she understood. She had already learned to observe, to read people, to recognize the unspoken rules that governed acceptance. This was simply another layer of that understanding. But beneath her acceptance, something more complex began to take shape. She realized that identity was no longer something fixed, something inherited without question. It could be adjusted, reframed, hidden. And while that gave her a certain kind of power, it also carried a cost she could not yet fully measure. Because with every small change, every careful word, every detail left unsaid, she felt a quiet distance forming not just between her and the world, but between who she was and who she was becoming. Living between two truths. As the new identity settled into place, it did not arrive with resistance from the outside world. In fact, it was accepted with surprising ease. Neighbors, acquaintances, even new social circles received the Green family without hesitation, seeing in them exactly what they expected to see. There were no questions, no suspicions, no challenges. And in that effortless acceptance, Belle learned one of the most unsettling truths of all, that the world often believed what it wanted to believe. At first, the change felt almost invisible. Daily life continued as it always had. Lessons were studied, conversations carried on, routines maintained. But beneath that surface, everything had shifted. Every introduction now carried intention. Every answer required thought. Every interaction became a quiet calculation. Belle began to understand that this was not simply a change in name, it was a performance. And like any performance, it required consistency. She learned quickly how to respond without revealing too much, how to allow others to draw their own conclusions without correcting them, how to remain composed when questions drifted too close to something that could not be explained. It became instinctive, almost effortless, but never natural. There were moments, small and fleeting, when the weight of it surfaced. A question asked too directly, a memory that could not be shared, a detail that had to be reshaped before it could be spoken aloud. In those moments, she felt the quiet tension of holding two truths at once, the one she lived and the one she presented. Her siblings adapted in their own ways. Some embraced the transformation fully, finding comfort in the opportunities it offered, in the ease with which doors opened. Others carried a quiet unease, a sense that something essential had been left behind. Belle stood somewhere in between. She understood the necessity of what her mother had done. She saw the protection it offered, the future it made possible. But she also felt the absence of something she could not reclaim. Her father's presence lingered in that absence. Not in physical form, but in memory, in the lessons he had taught, in the values he had lived by, in the quiet insistence that truth mattered above all else. Sometimes, in still moments, she would wonder what he would think of the life they were now living, whether he would see it as survival or surrender. That question never left her. It followed her through each carefully measured conversation, each new introduction, each moment where she chose what to say and what to leave unsaid. And yet, despite the complexity, she did not resist the path laid before her. She walked it with the same discipline she had been taught since childhood, the same attention to detail, the same quiet determination, because she understood something clearly now. The world was not shaped by truth alone, it was shaped by perception. And if perception could be managed, if it could be guided, controlled, carefully constructed, then perhaps it could be used, not just to survive, but to move forward. Still, beneath that growing awareness, a question remained, steady and unresolved. If the world accepted her for who she appeared to be, then who, truly, was she becoming? The cost of becoming someone else. Over time, the new identity no longer felt like something temporary. It settled into Belle's life with a quiet permanence, shaping not only how others saw her, but how she began to see herself. The name Dee Costa no longer sounded unfamiliar when spoken aloud. It fit smoothly into conversations, into introductions, into the spaces where her old name had once existed. And with each passing day, the distance between those two versions of herself grew wider. It was not a sudden loss, not something she could point to and say had disappeared. It was gradual, subtle, like a memory fading not because it was forgotten, but because it was no longer used. Her past, once vivid and central, became something she carried privately, something that could not be fully shared without consequence. She learned to separate her thoughts from her words, her memories from her stories. It was a skill, one she developed with precision, but it required constant awareness. Every conversation became a quiet act of control. Not deception in the way others might imagine, but careful omission, a shaping of truth to fit the boundaries the world had set. And while it allowed her to move forward, to exist in spaces that might otherwise have been closed to her, it also created a tension she could never fully escape. There were moments when it surfaced unexpectedly, a question about family history, a casual remark about heritage, a story that others shared freely, while she remained silent, calculating what could be said without unraveling everything. In those moments, she felt it most clearly, the weight of maintaining something that could not be seen, but could never be forgotten. Her mother carried that same weight, though she bore it differently. Genevieve never wavered in her decision. There was no regret in her actions, no visible doubt, only determination. She had chosen this path with full awareness of its cost, and she intended to see it through. Belle respected that strength, even as she began to understand what it required, because this was not simply a change in identity. It was a commitment, a life lived within carefully drawn lines, where one misstep could undo everything. And yet, within that constraint, Belle began to discover something unexpected, a sense of control, a recognition that identity, though shaped by the world, could also be shaped in return. She was no longer just reacting to what was given to her. She was learning to navigate it, to use it, to move within it with intention. It was not freedom in the purest sense, but it was a form of power. Still, that power came with a quiet, persistent cost. Because no matter how carefully she adapted, no matter how seamlessly she moved between expectation and reality, one truth remained unchanged. There was a part of her life that could never be fully lived in the open, and as that realization settled deeper within her, she began to understand something that would follow her for years to come, that becoming someone else might allow you to survive, but it would never allow you to be entirely whole. A mind that found its escape. As Belle stepped further into adolescence, the world around her continued to demand careful navigation, but within her, something steady began to take root. If identity had become uncertain, if truth had to be managed, then knowledge remained the one place where clarity still existed. Books did not question who she was. They did not measure her worth by appearance or assumption. They simply opened, and in doing so, offered her a way out, if only in thought. Reading became more than habit. It became refuge. She immersed herself in pages with a quiet intensity, drawn not only to the stories themselves, but to the structure beneath them. She noticed how ideas were arranged, how arguments were built, how information connected across chapters, across subjects, across time. Where others saw content, Belle saw patterns, order, meaning. She began to organize her own small collection of books with deliberate care, grouping them by subject, by theme, by logic only she fully understood. It was a simple act, almost insignificant from the outside, but to her, it brought a sense of control that her life otherwise lacked. In a world where identity could shift and perception could change without warning, this was something she could define, something she could make sense of. Her curiosity extended beyond reading itself. She became fascinated with how knowledge was preserved, how it was categorized, how it could be made accessible or hidden. She wondered who decided what was important enough to be recorded and what was left behind. These questions lingered, quietly shaping the direction of her thoughts long before she could name them as purpose. Her education continued under her mother's guidance, but the influence of her father had not disappeared. It lived on in the discipline of her thinking, in the precision of her understanding, in the expectation she placed upon herself. She studied not to impress, but because she could not ignore the pull of learning. It had become part of her identity, perhaps the only part that felt entirely her own. Music remained a presence as well. The piano, once simply a source of comfort, became another form of expression, another way to navigate emotion without words. Her fingers moved across the keys with increasing confidence, translating thoughts she could not speak into sound she could control. It was different from reading, but equally grounding. Both required focus. Both demanded attention. Both offered something the outside world could not: consistency. Yet even within this growing sense of direction, the tension of her dual existence remained. It did not disappear. It adapted, settling quietly beneath the surface, present but not always visible. Belle learned to carry it without letting it consume her, to move forward without constantly looking back. And in doing so, she began to shape something new, not just a life defined by circumstance, but a path guided by intention. She did not yet know where it would lead, but she understood this much. If the world required her to become someone else, then she would become someone extraordinary, stepping into a larger world. As Belle grew older, the boundaries of her world began to expand beyond the careful structure of her home. The routines that had once defined her day's lessons, reading, music, now felt like preparation for something larger, something waiting just beyond reach. That opportunity came when she was offered a place at the Northern Seminary for Young Ladies in Massachusetts. It was more than an education, it was a departure. Leaving Washington meant stepping away from the environment that had shaped her, from the quiet protection her mother had constructed, and into a world where she would have to carry her carefully formed identity on her own. The decision was not made lightly. There was risk in it, risk of exposure, of missteps, of questions she might not be able to answer. But there was also possibility, and Belle, guided by the same quiet determination that had defined her from childhood, chose to go. Massachusetts felt different from the moment she arrived. The air was cooler, the pace more restrained, the atmosphere marked by a kind of formality that demanded precision in both thought and behavior. The seminary itself stood with quiet authority, its routines structured, its expectations clear. Here, discipline was not optional, it was assumed. Belle adapted quickly. Structure had never intimidated her. In fact, she found comfort in it. Days filled with lectures, recitations, and independent study created a rhythm she could rely on. And within that rhythm, she thrived. Her mind, already sharpened by years of self-directed learning, absorbed new material with ease. She did not simply complete assignments, she went beyond them, seeking connections, exploring ideas from multiple angles, asking questions that revealed a depth others often overlooked. Her instructors noticed. There was something different about her, not just intelligence, but focus, a quiet intensity that did not demand attention, yet naturally drew it. She carried herself with composure, spoke with care, and listened with purpose. In a place where many sought recognition, Belle seemed almost detached from it, as though her motivation came from somewhere deeper than approval. And yet, even in this environment, the awareness she had developed at home remained with her. She was careful, always careful. Conversations about family, about background, about origin were approached with the same precision she applied to her studies. She revealed only what was necessary, allowing others to form their own conclusions, never offering more than she could safely sustain. It became second nature, effortless on the surface, constant beneath it. Still, there was a sense of movement in her life now that had not existed before, a feeling that she was stepping into something larger than the constraints she had known. The world was no longer something she observed from a distance. It was something she was entering, shaping, navigating on her own terms. And for the first time, she began to see a future not defined solely by survival, but by direction. She did not yet know exactly what form it would take, but she could feel it forming, slowly but surely, like a path revealing itself step by step beneath her feet, the place where she belonged. It was during one summer, after years of disciplined study, that Belle stepped into a space that felt unlike anything she had known before, Amherst College. The opportunity came quietly, almost modestly, a seasonal position, temporary, easily overlooked by others. But for Belle, it marked something far greater. The moment she entered its library, she felt it immediately, not excitement, not awe, something deeper, recognition. Rows upon rows of books stretched before her, not as scattered objects, but as a system waiting to be understood. Manuscripts, bound volumes, fragile documents layered with time, each one carrying knowledge, history, memory. But they were not yet fully ordered, not yet fully accessible, and that, to Belle, was not chaos. It was possibility. Here, knowledge was not just consumed, it was structured, preserved, given form. The emerging field of cataloging was beginning to take shape, driven by a growing need to manage the vast accumulation of information held within institutions like Amherst. It required patience, precision, and ability to see patterns where others saw only volume. And as she began to learn the processes, classification, organization, the careful handling of aged materials, something within her aligned completely. This was not new to her, it was familiar, the instinct she had developed as a child, arranging books, seeking order, creating systems that made sense to her mind. It all returned, but now with purpose, with direction. She approached the work with quiet focus, absorbing each method, each principle, each detail, how to trace the origin of a document, how to group materials by subject, by relevance, by connection, how to create a structure that would allow others to navigate knowledge with clarity. It was meticulous work, often overlooked, rarely celebrated, but to Belle, it felt essential, because within that work, there was truth, not the kind that had to be hidden or reshaped, but the kind that could be preserved, protected, made accessible without distortion. For the first time, she found a space where identity did not need to be managed in the same way. The work spoke for itself. Precision mattered, skill mattered, consistency mattered, and she had all three. Those around her began to take notice, not through grand recognition, but through quiet trust. She was reliable, thorough, capable, and in an environment shaped by tradition and expectation, that reliability carried weight. Still, she remained careful. The habits she had learned did not disappear. Conversations still required awareness. Background still required control. But here, those concerns felt less central, because here, she was not defined first by who she was, but by what she could do. And that difference changed everything. As the summer drew on, Belle began to understand something clearly. This was not just an opportunity, it was direction, a path that aligned with the way her mind worked, with the discipline she carried, with the quiet need for order she had always felt but never fully understood. For the first time, the future did not feel uncertain. It felt structured, possible, real. And though she would leave Amherst at the end of that season, something of it would remain with her. Not just the experience, but the certainty that she had found where she belonged, not in the identity she presented to the world, but in the work she was meant to do. A future taking shape. When Belle returned from Amherst, she was no longer simply a student following a path laid out before her. Something had shifted quietly but permanently. What had once been curiosity had now become direction. She understood, perhaps for the first time with certainty, where her strengths truly lay and how they could shape her future. The world of books was no longer just a refuge. It was a calling. Back at the seminary, her studies took on new meaning. Each lesson, each assignment, each hour spent reading or writing now felt connected to something larger than academic success. She was no longer learning for the sake of learning alone. She was preparing, building towards something that existed beyond the classroom walls. Her approach became even more focused, more deliberate. Where others studied to complete tasks, Belle studied to master them. She paid attention not only to content, but to structure, to organization, to the underlying systems that held knowledge together. She asked questions others did not think to ask. She explored beyond what was required, and in doing so, she began to stand apart, not loudly, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that could not be overlooked. Her instructors recognized it. There was a clarity in her thinking, a precision in her work that reflected not just intelligence, but discipline. She approached problems methodically, broke them down, rebuilt them with understanding. It was the same instinct she had applied to books as a child, only now it extended to everything she touched. Yet even as her academic identity strengthened, the complexity of her personal identity remained. The careful balance she maintained did not disappear with success. If anything, it became more important. The further she moved into spaces of opportunity, the more she understood how much depended on perception. One wrong detail, one misplaced truth, could undo everything she had built. So she remained vigilant, controlled, aware. It was not fear that guided her, it was understanding. She knew the rules of the world she was navigating, and she followed them with precision. But beneath that control, something else began to emerge: confidence. Not the kind that seeks recognition, but the kind that comes from knowing one's own capability. Belle no longer questioned whether she belonged in the spaces she was entering. She proved it, quietly, consistently, through her work. And that proof gave her something no constructed identity ever could: internal certainty. She began to imagine a future more clearly now. Not just a continuation of study, but a life built around knowledge, around order, around the preservation and organization of ideas. A life where her strengths were not hidden, but essential. The path ahead was still uncertain in its details, but its direction was no longer in question. She was moving towards something real, something earned, and for the first time, that movement felt entirely her own, mastering the invisible rules. As Belle moved closer to adulthood, success no longer came as a surprise, it became a pattern. Her work was consistent, her thinking precise, her presence quietly commanding in ways that did not require attention to be effective. She had learned how to excel without drawing unnecessary scrutiny, how to stand out without appearing to do so. It was a balance few could maintain, but for Belle, it had become second nature. Yet what truly set her apart was not just her intellect, it was her awareness. She had spent years learning not only how to think, but how to exist within systems that were never designed for her. And that understanding gave her an advantage that went beyond academics. She observed everything. The way people spoke when they felt comfortable, the way their tone shifted when they did not, the subtle hierarchies that shaped every environment, often without being acknowledged. She learned to read these patterns as easily as she read books, adjusting her behavior with careful precision. In classrooms, she was thoughtful and composed, offering insight without overstepping. Among peers, she was approachable, yet reserved enough to avoid questions that ventured too far into her personal life. With instructors, she was respectful, attentive, always prepared. Every interaction was intentional, not in a calculated or manipulative sense, but in a way that reflected deep understanding. She knew what the world expected to see, and she gave it just enough to remain unquestioned. This ability did not feel like deception to her. It felt like fluency, like learning a language that others spoke without realizing it. And once learned, it could not be unlearned. It allowed her to move through spaces with ease, to avoid conflict before it formed, to maintain control even in uncertain situations. But mastery of these invisible rules came at a cost. It required constant awareness, a level of attention that never fully rested. There was no moment where she could simply exist without consideration, without the quiet evaluation of what was safe, what was appropriate, what was expected. Even in success, that awareness remained. Still, she did not resent it. If anything, she refined it, turned it into strength, because she understood something clearly now. The world rewarded those who could navigate it, not those who resisted it blindly. And Belle had no intention of being left behind. Her ambitions, though never loudly declared, were growing. She no longer saw herself confined to limited roles or expectations. She saw possibility, not just in what she could achieve, but in how far she could go if she continued to move with the same precision, the same discipline, the same control. She was building more than a future. She was building position. And with each step forward, she became more certain of one thing: that the life she was creating carefully, deliberately, piece by piece, was not an accident. It was the result of everything she had learned, everything she had endured, everything she had chosen to become. The edge of opportunity. By the time Belle reached the final stages of her education, the question was no longer whether she was capable, it was where that capability would take her. The world ahead was opening, but not without limits. Opportunities for women were already narrow. For a woman navigating a carefully constructed identity, they were narrower still, and yet Belle stood at that threshold with a quiet readiness that set her apart. She was no longer reacting to circumstance. She was preparing to choose. The path she had begun to see at Amherst continued to pull at her the world of libraries, of systems, of knowledge preserved and made accessible. It was not a field that promised recognition or visibility. It was not a path that drew attention, but it was one that required exactly what she possessed: discipline, precision, patience, and an instinct for order that could not be taught. Her mother saw it too. Genevieve, who had guided her children through uncertainty with unwavering resolve, recognized in Belle something that needed room to grow. She did not push her daughter toward a specific future. Instead, she offered support in the form that mattered most: encouragement to continue, to step forward, to pursue the opportunities that aligned with her strengths. It was a quiet endorsement, but a powerful one. Belle accepted it without hesitation. The decision to move forward to seek a place where her abilities could be fully realized did not come with doubt. It came with clarity. She had spent years preparing for this moment, even if she had not fully known it at the time. Every book she had read, every system she had organized, every careful interaction she had navigated it, had all led here, to the edge of something real. And yet, even as she prepared to step into this next phase, the duality of her life remained present. It had become part of her, inseparable from the way she moved through the world. She no longer questioned it in the same way she once had. Instead, she carried it with her, integrated into her understanding of what it meant to succeed. It was not something she could leave behind, but it was something she had learned to manage. What mattered now was not where she had come from, but where she was going. And that direction was becoming clearer with each passing day. She envisioned spaces filled with knowledge, systems waiting to be built, collections waiting to be understood. She saw herself within them not as an outsider, but as someone essential to their function. That vision did not feel like imagination. It felt like inevitability. Still, beneath that growing certainty, there remained a quiet awareness, one she would never fully escape, that everything she was building rested on a foundation that required care, precision, control. One misstep could shift it all, but Belle did not allow that awareness to hold her back. Instead, it sharpened her focus, strengthened her resolve, because she understood something now with complete clarity. Opportunity did not belong to those who waited for it. It belonged to those who were ready when it appeared. And Belle was ready. Entering a world of prestige, when Belle finally stepped beyond the structured protection of her education and into the professional world, she entered a space defined not just by knowledge but by power. Institutions like libraries and universities were more than places of learning. They were gatekeepers of culture, history, and legitimacy. And for someone like Belle, gaining access to that world was not simply an achievement, it was a transformation. The transition was not dramatic. There were no grand announcements, no sudden shifts in circumstance. Instead, it unfolded as her life always had, through quiet progression, careful positioning, and the steady accumulation of trust. Her work spoke before she ever needed to. The skills she had refined at Amherst, the discipline shaped by her upbringing, and the awareness sharpened by years of navigating unspoken rules all came together seamlessly. She approached her responsibilities with precision, organizing information with a clarity that others often overlooked, bringing order to systems that had long existed without structure. It did not take long for those around her to recognize her value. Not loudly, not publicly, but in the way opportunities began to appear, in the way she was given more responsibility, in the quiet confidence placed in her ability to handle complex tasks. She was not just participating in the system, she was becoming essential to it. And yet, even as she moved deeper into this world, she remained aware of the delicate balance she carried. The environments she now occupied were shaped by expectation, by tradition, by assumptions that ran deep and often unchallenged. Her presence within them depended not only on her capability, but on her ability to remain within the boundaries those spaces imposed. So she did what she had always done. She observed, adapted, maintained control. Conversations remained measured, personal details carefully limited. She allowed her work to define her, not her past. And in doing so, she built something remarkably stable, a position grounded in merit, protected by perception, sustained through consistency. There was a quiet power in that, a recognition that she had moved beyond survival and into influence. Even if that influence was not always visible, she was shaping systems, organizing knowledge, contributing to institutions that would outlast her. It was not the kind of legacy that drew attention, but it was real. Still, beneath the stability she had created, the foundation remained complex. The identity she presented and the truth she carried were no longer in conflict, but they were never fully aligned, and perhaps they never would be. But Belle no longer saw that as a weakness. She had learned to exist within that space, to function with clarity even when her reality was layered. And in that understanding, she found something few others ever did. Not certainty, but control. And with that control, she continued forward into a world that had never been built for her, yet one she was steadily learning to master. Recognition without exposure. As Belle settled deeper into her professional life, her presence within these institutions became increasingly difficult to ignore, though not in the way most would expect. She was not loud, not self-promoting, not someone who sought attention, and yet, her work began to carry weight. Systems she organized functioned more efficiently. Collections she managed became more accessible. Problems that had once lingered unresolved found quiet solutions under her care. It was not dramatic, but it was undeniable. Recognition came, but subtly. A mention in conversation, a recommendation passed quietly from one colleague to another. Increased responsibility, offered without ceremony, but with clear intent. Those who worked closely with her understood her value, even if they could not always articulate it fully. She became someone people relied on not for visibility, but for precision, for consistency, for results. And in that quiet recognition, Belle found something both empowering and complicated, because the more she was trusted, the more visible she became within spaces that still operated under rigid assumptions about who belonged and who did not. Her success did not erase those assumptions, it existed alongside them, carefully balanced, never directly challenged. She understood that clearly. She knew that her position depended not only on her ability, but on the continuity of perception. So she maintained it, effortlessly on the surface, constantly beneath it. Conversations remained controlled, personal history selectively shared, identity carefully aligned with expectation. It was no longer something she consciously thought through at every moment. It had become instinct, a reflex shaped by years of practice. But that instinct did not mean ease. There were still moments when the weight of it pressed through, a passing remark about heritage, a casual discussion about family lineage, a question asked without suspicion, yet carrying the potential to unravel more than intended. In those moments, Belle responded as she always had, with composure, with precision, with just enough truth to satisfy, and just enough distance to protect. And then she moved forward, as if nothing had shifted. What made her different was not just her ability to navigate these moments, but her refusal to let them define her. She did not dwell on the tension. She did not allow it to disrupt the work that mattered most. Instead, she focused on what she could control, the systems she built, the knowledge she preserved, the quiet impact she made in spaces that rarely acknowledged those like her. In doing so, she created a kind of legacy that did not depend on recognition to exist. It lived in the structure of things, in the order she imposed, in the clarity she brought to complexity. And perhaps that was enough. Or perhaps it had to be. Because the alternative, stepping outside the boundaries she had learned to navigate, carried risks she understood too well to ignore. So she continued forward, steady and precise, building a life that balanced visibility and invisibility in equal measure. A life where she could be seen for what she did, but never fully for who she was. And for now, that balance held. The life she built from the outside, Belle's life had become something many would admire. Stability, respectability, a position within institutions that carried influence, even if it was not always visible. She had achieved what few could, especially for a woman of her time, let alone one carrying the complexities she did. Her days were structured, her work meaningful, her presence quietly established. There was no chaos, no visible struggle, no sign of the careful navigation that had brought her here. It appeared seamless, intentional, complete. She had built a life that functioned exactly as it needed to. But beneath that surface, the layers remained. They always had. The identity she presented had long since settled into something natural in practice, yet it never fully replaced the truth beneath it. Instead, the two coexisted, rarely colliding, but never fully merging. Belle no longer questioned this duality the way she once had. It was no longer a source of confusion or internal conflict. It had become structure, a framework through which she understood herself and the world around her. There was strength in that, a kind of clarity that came not from simplicity, but from acceptance. She knew what she was doing. She knew why she was doing it, and most importantly, she knew what it allowed her to achieve. Relationships, however, remained more complex. Connections with others were carefully maintained, built on trust, but always within boundaries she controlled. She could engage, contribute, exist within social circles, but never without awareness of where those connections might lead. There were parts of her life that could not be shared freely, and that reality shaped the depth of every interaction. It did not isolate her entirely, but it defined the limits of closeness. Even within her own family, the shared understanding of their constructed identity created a bond that was both unifying and restrictive. They moved together, supported one another, but always within the unspoken agreement of what could and could not be said beyond their private spaces. It was a form of unity, but one shaped by necessity rather than openness. And yet, despite these constraints, Belle did not see her life as incomplete. She had created something real, something stable, something that allowed her to exist with purpose and direction. Her work mattered, the systems she built, the knowledge she preserved, the quiet influence she held within her field. These were not illusions, they were tangible, lasting, meaningful. If there was a cost, she had already accepted it, not as a burden, but as part of the structure she lived within. She had learned long ago that the world did not always offer perfect choices, only necessary ones, and she had made hers. Still, in moments of stillness, when the demands of her work faded and the noise of the world softened, there were thoughts that lingered. Not regrets, not quite, but reflections on what had been left behind, on what might have been different under other circumstances, on the version of herself that existed only in memory, untouched by the decisions that had shaped everything that followed. Those thoughts did not disrupt her. They simply existed, quietly, alongside everything she had built. Because Belle understood something with a clarity few ever reached, that a life could be both complete and divided at the same time. And that sometimes, the two were not contradictions but realities that had to be carried together. The years of quiet success. As time moved forward, Belle's life settled into a rhythm that, from the outside, appeared steady and even enviable. Years passed not in dramatic shifts, but in quiet accumulation of work completed, systems improved, responsibilities expanded. She became a fixture within her professional environment, someone whose presence was no longer questioned because it had proven itself indispensable. The work she did was not the kind that drew headlines or public recognition. It existed in the background, woven into the structure of institutions that relied on order to function. Catalogs became clearer, collections more accessible, information easier to navigate. These changes did not bear her name, but they carried her influence, and for Belle, that was enough. She did not seek visibility. In fact, invisibility, when chosen, offered a kind of protection she had long understood. By remaining just outside the center of attention, she preserved the balance she had spent her life maintaining. She could succeed without inviting scrutiny, contribute without being examined too closely. It was a position she occupied with precision, never drifting too far in either direction. Her reputation grew quietly. Those who worked alongside her came to rely on her judgment, her consistency, her ability to bring clarity where others saw only complexity. She was trusted not because she demanded it, but because she earned it again and again, through action rather than assertion. And yet, even as her professional life strengthened, the personal boundaries she had built remained firmly in place. Time did not erase them. If anything, it reinforced them. The longer she lived within the identity she had constructed, the more essential it became to maintain it without fracture. It was no longer simply about opportunity, it was about preservation. There was no single moment where she considered stepping outside of it, no sudden urge to reveal what had been hidden. That part of her life had been carefully folded away, not forgotten, but contained. And over time, the act of containing it became second nature. Still, the passage of years brought its own kind of reflection. Belle was no longer the young woman learning how to navigate the world. She was someone who had already done so, successfully, repeatedly. The urgency that had once driven her had softened, replaced by a steadier, more measured awareness of where she stood. She had built something lasting, something real. But time also had a way of bringing questions back into focus, not loudly, not insistently, but quietly, in moments of pause. Questions about legacy, about what remained after the work was done, about what parts of a life could truly endure and which would fade without ever being fully known. These were not questions she needed to answer immediately, but they existed now, woven into the rhythm of her days, just beneath the surface of everything she had created. And as her life continued forward, steady and controlled, those questions would begin to matter more than she expected. Not because they threatened what she had built, but because they asked something deeper, not who she appeared to be, but who she had always been beneath it all, the weight of what remains unsaid. As the years continued to pass, the life Belle had constructed held firm, but its silence grew heavier in ways that were not immediately visible. Success had become routine, stability expected, and the careful balance she maintained no longer required the same conscious effort it once had. But with that ease came something else, a stillness that left more room for thought. There were fewer new challenges to occupy her attention, fewer uncertainties, demanding immediate action. And in that space, reflection began to take root. It did not arrive all at once. It surfaced in moments brief, quiet, almost unnoticeable at first. A conversation that lingered longer than me knowing, a memory that appeared uninvited, sharp in detail despite the years that had passed. These moments did not disrupt her life, but they stayed with her. Belle had spent so long managing what was visible that she rarely allowed herself to fully engage with what remained hidden, not because she feared it, but because there had never been a need to confront it directly. Her choices had been made, her path defined, and for a long time, that had been enough. But now, with time stretching behind her as much as it did ahead, the perspective began to shift. She started to consider not just what she had built, but what had been left unspoken in the process. Her father's absence, once a distant and complicated memory, returned with a different clarity, not as a source of conflict, but as a point of origin. The values he had instilled, the principles he had lived by, had never truly left her. They existed beneath everything she had done, even when her actions had moved in a different direction. Her mother's decision, too, took on new meaning. What had once been understood as necessity now revealed its full weight not just as a choice made in a moment, but as a reality sustained over a lifetime. Belle could see it more clearly now. The strength it required, the cost it carried, the silence it demanded, and in recognizing that, she began to see her own life differently, not as a departure from truth, but as a continuation of a decision made long before she fully understood it. This realization did not bring regret. It brought understanding, a deeper awareness of the complexity she had lived within, the forces that had shaped her, the reasons behind every careful step she had taken. Still, there was something that remained unresolved, not in action, but in acknowledgement. A sense that parts of her story existed only within her, unshared, unrecorded, known only through memory. And as someone who had dedicated her life to preserving knowledge, to organizing and protecting information, so it would not be lost, That realization carried a quiet significance because she understood better than most what it meant for something to disappear without record, to exist fully, and then leave no trace. And for the first time, that thought did not feel distant. It felt personal, not urgent, not overwhelming, but present, a quiet question forming beneath everything she had built. Not about whether her life had meaning, it clearly did, but about how much of that meaning would remain once she was gone, and how much would be lost, forever unspoken. The truth she chose to keep as Belle grew older. The question of what to reveal and what to keep no longer felt abstract. It became something real, something present in the quiet spaces of her daily life. She had spent decades building a world that functioned with precision, a life that held together because every detail had been considered, every boundary maintained. To disrupt that now would not simply change how others saw her, it would unravel the very structure that had allowed her to exist as she had. And Belle understood that more clearly than anyone. The truth she carried was not a single fact that could be easily spoken and set free. It was layered, connected to every part of her life, woven into her name, her history, her relationships, her place in the world. To reveal it would not be an act of honesty alone, it would be an act of transformation. And not just for her, for everyone connected to her. So she made a decision, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet certainty that had guided so many of her choices before. She would keep it, not out of fear, not out of shame, but out of understanding. She knew what that truth meant in the world she lived in. She knew how it would be received, how it would be interpreted, how it would reshape everything she had spent her life building. And she also knew something just as important, that the life she had created was real, regardless of how it had begun. Her work, her contributions, the systems she had built, the knowledge she had preserved, none of it was false. None of it depended on revelation to have value. That was where her certainty came from. She did not need to prove who she was by exposing what had been hidden. She had already proven it through everything she had done. Still, the decision carried a quiet finality. It meant that parts of her story would remain hers alone, never fully spoken, never entirely understood by the world she had navigated so carefully. It meant accepting that her life would be known, but not completely, that her legacy would exist, but not in full clarity. And she was at peace with that, because she had come to understand something that few ever truly grasp. That identity is not defined by a single truth, but by the totality of a life lived. And her life complex, controlled, carefully constructed, was no less real because of what it concealed. In the end, the truth she carried was not something she needed to release in order to feel whole. It was something she had already integrated, already understood, already made part of herself in a way that required no external validation. So she continued forward, as she always had, quietly, precisely, with full awareness of what she held and full control over what she chose to share. And in that control, she found something that had eluded her in earlier years. Not just stability, not just success, but resolution, the life nearing its end. As time moved quietly forward, the rhythm of Belle's life began to slow, not abruptly, but with the natural, almost imperceptible shift that comes with age. The urgency that had once shaped her every decision had long since softened into routine. The careful vigilance she had maintained for decades was still present, but it no longer felt like a constant effort. It had become part of her, as instinctive as breath. Her work, once central to her daily existence, gradually receded. Not because it had lost its meaning, but because she had already given it everything it required. The systems she had built continued to function. The structures she had created remained intact. Her presence, though less visible now, was still embedded within the work she left behind. And in that, there was a quiet sense of completion. Her days became simpler, more contained. The world beyond her immediate surroundings continued to change, to move forward, but she no longer felt the need to keep pace with it. She had already found her place within it. Now, she existed more within memory than momentum. There was a stillness to her life that had not existed before. Not emptiness, but reflection. She spent more time in thought, in observation, in the quiet revisiting of moments that had shaped her. Her childhood home, her father's voice, her mother's steady resolve, the long path between who she had been and who she had become. These memories did not arrive with regret. They came with clarity, with a kind of understanding that only distance could provide. She could see now how each decision had led to the next, how every choice, whether made by her or for her, had shaped the life she ultimately lived. There were no illusions left, only truth. And yet, even as she moved closer to the end of her life, the central truth she had carried remained untouched. It had never slipped, never been exposed. It existed within her as it always had, complete, contained, unspoken. She did not feel the need to change that now. The world had known her in a certain way for so long that altering it would no longer serve a purpose. It would not change what she had done. It would not redefine the life she had built. It would only shift perception, and perception, she had long understood, was never the full measure of a person. So she let it remain. The life she had lived was enough. The truth she carried was hers. And as the days grew quieter, more distant, more reflective, she found herself returning not to questions but to acceptance. She had navigated a world that demanded more of her than it did of most. She had adapted, endured, succeeded. She had built something lasting in a life that had never been simple. And now, as that life began to draw toward its final chapter, there was no need for resolution, because in the quiet, in the stillness, she had already found it, the room where it ends. In the final days of her life, the world around Belle grew smaller, quieter, reduced to the space she now occupied, a modest room in New York, carefully arranged, deliberately controlled, much like everything else she had built. There was no chaos here, no sign of disorder or neglect. Even in decline, she maintained a sense of structure, of quiet discipline that had followed her for decades. The curtains remained drawn, allowing only faint light to press against the edges of the room. The air felt still, undisturbed, as though time itself had slowed within those walls. There were no visitors moving in and out, no constant presence at her bedside. Her life, so carefully managed, approached its end in the same way it had been lived, privately, deliberately, alone. But the most telling detail was not the silence, nor the solitude. It was the drawers, locked, every single one of them. Placed throughout the room, tucked into furniture, hidden in plain sight, each drawer held something she had chosen to keep, not openly, but not discarded either. They were not random, they were intentional, a physical reflection of the life she had lived, compartmentalized, preserved, protected. Inside them were fragments of her story, documents, letters, traces of identity that did not fully align with the life the world believed she had lived. Evidence, not of deception, but of complexity, of a truth that had never been denied but never revealed. Belle knew what they contained. She had arranged them herself, over time, with care and precision. Nothing misplaced, nothing accidental. Even now, as her strength faded, that control remained, because this was the final boundary, the last division between what had been lived and what had been known. Her breathing slowed, each breath softer than the last, the rhythm of her body gradually releasing its hold on the world she had navigated for so long. There was no fear in it, no visible struggle, only a quiet awareness, as though she understood exactly where she was, within the arc of her own life. And perhaps she did. Because everything that had defined her, every decision, every adaptation, every carefully measured step had led here, to this room, to this moment, to this silence. Her eyes, once sharp and observant, now barely opened, yet there was still something present within them, not uncertainty, not regret, but recognition, of a life completed, of a truth carried fully, even if never spoken aloud. And then, without ceremony, without witness, her final breath came, soft, unmarked, almost indistinguishable from the quiet that surrounded it. For a moment, nothing changed. The room remained still. The drawers remained closed. The world outside continued, unaware. But something had shifted. because the moment she was gone, the control she had maintained for so long ended with her, and the things she had chosen to keep hidden were no longer entirely hers to protect. When the drawers were opened at first, nothing happened. The room remained untouched, held in the same stillness that had surrounded her final moments. Outside, life moved forward without pause, unaware that anything of consequence had ended behind those closed curtains. But eventually, as it always does, the world turned its attention inward. Someone entered the room, not with urgency, not with suspicion, just routine. The quiet, practical necessity that follows death. A life had ended, and what remained needed to be sorted, cataloged, understood. At a glance, there was nothing unusual. The space was orderly, modest, almost unremarkable. But then, there were the drawers. So many of them, all locked. That detail alone was enough to disrupt the simplicity of the moment. One drawer might have suggested caution, two, perhaps privacy, but dozens carefully secured, deliberately inaccessible, suggested something else entirely: intention. The first drawer was opened without ceremony, the lock forced with basic tools, the expectation no greater than finding personal belongings, letters, keepsakes, the quiet remnants of an ordinary life. But what lay inside was not ordinary. Documents, old papers, names that did not fully align, records that pointed toward a different past, a different identity than the one she had lived publicly for decades. At first, it was confusion, a detail that did not fit, then another and another. Each drawer revealed more pieces of a story that had been carefully separated, stored away, never allowed to exist together in a single place, until now. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. The woman they believed they knew, the identity she had carried, the life she had presented, was only part of the truth. Beneath it was another history, one that stretched back further, one that connected to a reality she had never spoken of. It was not a simple revelation. It did not resolve cleanly into a single explanation. Instead, it expanded, layer by layer, challenging every assumption that had defined her in the eyes of others. The realization came slowly, then all at once. She had lived between worlds, not by accident, not by confusion, but by choice, a deliberate, sustained decision that had shaped every part of her existence. The room, once quiet and contained, now held something entirely different. Not just the remains of a life, but the evidence of a truth that had outlived the person who carried it. And in that moment, the balance she had maintained for so long finally shifted, because what had once been controlled, protected, carefully managed, was now exposed to interpretation, to judgment, to a world that would try to make sense of it in ways she had never allowed while she was alive. The drawers stood open now, their contents no longer hidden, their meaning no longer hers alone, and as those fragments of her life were gathered, examined, pieced together, one thing became undeniable. The story of Belle Marion Greener, of the woman known as Dee. Costa had never been what it seemed, and only now, after her silence had become permanent, was the world beginning to see it. A life rewritten after death. Once the drawers were opened, the narrative that had defined Belle's life could no longer hold. What had once appeared complete, stable, coherent, unquestioned began to unravel, not into chaos, but into something far more complex. Piece by piece, the documents revealed connections that had never been visible before. Names traced back to a different lineage. Records pointed to a past that contradicted the identity she had lived under for so many years. It was not a single discovery that changed everything, but the accumulation of details that refused to be ignored. Those who encountered this evidence were left with a story that did not fit neatly into expectation. The woman they believed they knew, a figure of discipline, intellect, quiet contribution, was still there. That part had not been false, but it was incomplete. Beneath it existed another truth, one that had shaped her choices in ways no one had fully understood while she was alive. The revelation did not diminish her work. If anything, it complicated it. It forced a reconsideration not just of who she was, but of what it meant to live as she had. to navigate a world where identity could determine possibility, to construct a life within constraints that could not be openly challenged. Some would see it as deception, others as survival. But neither explanation alone was sufficient, because her life had never been defined by a single motive. It had been shaped by circumstance, by necessity, by awareness, and by a level of control that few could maintain over such a long span of time. The institutions she had worked within did not suddenly erase her contributions. The system she had built did not collapse under the weight of this new understanding. They remained, functioning as they always had, quiet, precise, enduring. And in that endurance there was a kind of truth that could not be rewritten. Her work had always been real. Her impact had always existed. What changed was not what she had done, but how it was understood. The world now faced a version of her that could not be simplified. A woman who had lived successfully within a constructed identity, not out of confusion, but with intention. A life that existed between categories, between definitions, between expectations that had never fully accounted for someone like her. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part. Not that she had hidden something, but that she had done so completely, for so long, without breaking the structure she had built. In death, the control she had maintained was gone. The narrative was no longer hers to shape. Others would interpret, analyze, debate. They would try to assign meaning, to place her within a framework they could understand. But no matter how they defined her, one fact remained unchanged. The life she lived, the choices she made, the work she accomplished, the world she navigated had been entirely real, even if the truth behind it had remained hidden until the very end, what the world chose to see. In the aftermath of the discovery, the story of Belle Marion Greener, known to many as Dee, Costa did not settle into a single agreed-upon truth. Instead, it fractured into perspectives, each shaped by the lens through which people chose to view her life. Some focused on the concealment, reducing her existence to an act of deception, a narrative of hidden identity that overshadowed everything else she had done. To them, the revelation became the defining feature, the detail that recontextualized every achievement, every relationship, every step she had taken. Others saw something different, not deception, but adaptation, a response to a world that imposed limits long before she ever had the chance to define herself freely. They understood the environment she had navigated, the restrictions she had worked within, and recognized the precision it must have taken to move through it as she did. To them, her life was not diminished by what she had concealed, it was made more remarkable by it. But even these interpretations, divided as they were, failed to capture the full reality, because Belle's life had never been lived for the purpose of being understood in retrospect. It had been lived in the present, shaped by immediate decisions, by circumstances that required action rather than explanation. The world, looking back, sought clarity. But clarity was never something her life had fully allowed. The institutions she had been part of responded in their own way. Records were adjusted, histories reconsidered, her place within them quietly reevaluated. Yet her work remained embedded in their foundations, unchanged by the shifting narrative surrounding her identity. The systems she had built did not carry her name prominently, but they carried her influence in ways that could not be undone. And perhaps that was where the truest measure of her life remained, not in how she was categorized after her death, but in what endured beyond it. Still, the fascination with her story persisted. People returned to it again and again, drawn not just by the revelation itself, but by the questions it raised, about identity, about truth, about the boundaries between who a person is and who they are allowed to be. Belle had lived within those questions without ever fully answering them. And now, in her absence, the world attempted to do what she never had defined her completely. But no matter how many interpretations emerged, none could fully contain the complexity of what she had been, because her life was not a single story, it was layers, choices made within constraints, truths carried without being spoken, a balance maintained across decades without collapse. And in that complexity, something remained clear. She had not lived a life that fit easily into expectation. She had lived one that required constant awareness, constant control, constant adaptation, and she had done so successfully, on her own terms. Whether the world understood that or not was no longer something she needed to manage. The silence that remains. In the end, after the documents were examined, the conclusions debated, and the story retold through countless perspectives, something remained that no discovery could fully resolve. Silence. Not the silence of absence, but the kind that lingers after everything has been said, when the answers no longer feel complete. Belle Marion Greener D. Costa had lived a life that resisted simplicity. Even in death, even with every drawer opened, every record uncovered, she could not be reduced to a single truth that satisfied every question. There were still gaps, still moments that could not be fully reconstructed, still intentions that could only be inferred, never confirmed, and perhaps that was fitting, because her life had never been about full disclosure. It had been about control, about choosing what to reveal, what to protect, what to carry alone. That control ended with her final breath, but its effects did not disappear. They remained embedded in the spaces she left behind, in the unanswered questions that continued to surround her story. The world would remember her in different ways. Some would focus on the revelation, seeing her life as a hidden narrative finally brought to light. Others would remember her work, the quiet precision of her contributions, the systems she helped shape, the knowledge she preserved. Both would be true, and neither would be complete. Because the essence of her life existed not in one version or the other, but in the tension between them. In the space where identity and perception did not fully align, where truth and survival coexisted without resolution, that was where she had lived, and that was where her story remained. There is a certain discomfort in that kind of ending, a desire to define, to conclude, to place a life into something understandable, but not all lives allow for that. Some resist closure, not because they are unfinished, but because they are too complex to be contained. Belle's life was one of them. She had navigated a world that demanded certainty while living within uncertainty. She had built something stable on a foundation that required constant care. She had succeeded without ever fully revealing the conditions of that success, and in doing so, she left behind not just a story, but a question, not about who she was, that, in many ways, was already known, but about what it means to truly understand a life shaped by forces that are not always visible, by choices that are not always freely made, by truths that are not always meant to be shared. In the quiet that followed her, that question remained, unanswered, unresolved, and perhaps exactly as she would have intended.